Okay, U.S. history, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, and we're going to get a few more notes today. I will say that I have some idea of how many people are watching the video, and of course, there was some practice yesterday. Now, I see some people have turned it in late, and that is absolutely better, better late than never. But all of those who turned it in on time, meaning by midnight of the day it was posted, because it posted at 7 a.m., anybody who posted it by midnight on Tuesday got triple tickets. Triple tickets for that, and that's something I'll carry forward. I'm just trying to get you guys to do the work when it's assigned. It's going to be a lot easier to keep up with it. A lot easier, but if you're watching this, you're on the right track, but a lot easier if you watch these videos, take the notes, etc. Just did midterms. They're due for teachers by Monday, and they were a little ugly, but there's still plenty of time to turn things around. So I will review some of the notes we've taken. So we've got 4 major documents, and we've only given you 2 so far. So let's quickly review those, and then we'll jump into the awful document, the Articles of Confederation, the one that is so bad it inspired us to write one that is infinitely better. So what was the document that declared our independence? Well, that seems pretty obvious, that was the Declaration of Independence, signed July 4th, 1776. The man we give credit for that is Thomas Jefferson, this man here. And some of the famous lines, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that came in 1776. Now, somehow, against all odds, we actually win the revolution. And now we've got all this new land, and how we're going to manage that land is settled up by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It divided this land held by the United States into smaller territories and set up a way that they could become states. There's even something called the Equal Footing Clause in this that says, and then as these new states come in, they're not like a second-tier level of states because they came in later. Ohio's the 17th state. We don't get treated less because we're not one of the original 13. And we don't get treated better than, say, a state that comes in 40th or 50th. Once you're a state, you're a state. So slavery was banned in this territory, so slavery did not exist in this territory. And it made up the states eventually of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Also encouraged public schools. And then I did have a note about the Virginia Military District, and then it's never going to be on the air test, but I just think it's interesting how the land in Connecticut that was ravaged by fires, they were granted land in Ohio where we live called the Fire Lands or Firelands. So a little local history. But we're going to pick up now on the 3rd document, the Articles of Confederation. So this is what we're governed from or with during the Revolution for the most part. So the Articles of Confederation are a really, really bad system. I mean, it did the job, but barely. George Washington, commander of the Revolutionary Forces, complained all the time that the governing body, the Articles of Confederation, the Congress under that just could not seem to function, could not seem to get him the basic necessities that he had to have. And so it had a series of problems. The biggest one, I think, is that it had no executive branch. We're going to get into what the branches do and why our government is set up the way it is, but they didn't want a king for sure. But you do still have to have someone who can make executive decisions. In other words, in this case, fast decisions. I always give the example of, let's say Mr. Talbot walked into our room and calmly said, hey class, you guys are being great. Let's get you guys pizza. I'm going to have a pizza party for your class. And if we had the time, we could say, oh, okay, where do you want to order it from? And we'd all have these different suggestions. Oh, what do you want to have on it? And maybe we come up with, one pizza place we can all live with and maybe 3 different types of pizza. But in this bizarre scenario, what if Talbot comes in and says, I'll get this class pizza if you can tell me exactly what you want in 10 seconds or less? What you need then is someone that we just designate as like the chief executive, a student that sits in the front row, because Mr. Talbot's will say in this pretend world known to do that. And in that emergency situation, that person says, oh, we're going to get it from Domino's and it's going to be pepperoni. And then we're one of the few classes that can act fast. Okay, now in real life, that doesn't really happen. But what's the scenario where it does? How about your country's being attacked by Great Britain? How about your country is under threat from Spanish forces right around the same time, from French forces right around the same time? There's a lot of threats against the early United States. And sometimes Congress would be arguing about what to do when really sometimes, because time is of the essence, you just need what we think of today as the president to go, here's what we're going to do. We'll argue about it later. So it had no executive branch. As a matter of fact, we're going to peek real quick at this. Now, this is not a document assignment. This is just a little bit more training because you're going to have documents on every single one of your tests. So it's just an idea of looking through it. This is not the primary document that you, or the document of the week that you were assigned, but it's just some excerpts from this that just gives you some idea of some of the problems. So first off, I would tell you that they described it as a firm league of friendship with each other. That's what they called their union. So in the United States today, I think of us as one country that happens to be divided up into 50 sections. Back then, it was almost more like 13 countries that were loosely bound together. So it was not a great affiliation. And, you know, sometimes it's real easy for me not to even think about the United States in terms of states. Back then, I think you might have said you were from, say, Delaware before you would have said the United States or Pennsylvania or whatever it might be. So a few other things, but this is a big one. In determining questions, every state had one vote. Well, that's weird because, you know, for every state to have one vote, there were, at that time, some states that were much larger, like Virginia, and they had far more population than New Jersey, but they still had the same number of votes. In today's world, we would look at, say, Texas, California, New York. Those are states that have huge populations. Good thing we don't have this system where those states would only get one vote, and yet North Dakota would also get one vote. So that's just a few of the things just that highlight some problems. So why does this matter? Well, this was done so poorly. And by the way, anything in blue you don't have to write, but Shays' Rebellion is just an incident that occurred. You don't really need to know it for this class. But essentially, there was no one to put down this rebellion that occurred in Massachusetts, and it just showed another weakness of our government under the Articles of Confederation. So a convention was held to fix the problems. Now, this convention, which ends up becoming known as the Constitutional Convention, is greatly influenced by the fact that the government system that we're under stinks. So they end up making a bunch of changes that still, you know, are in play today. They are the things that made the U.S. Constitution, the fourth document, the document that we're going to spend the overwhelming majority of our time on. So this convention was held, and in this convention, James Madison is the leading figure. So Thomas Jefferson was the main character I want you to think of with the Declaration of Independence. But he was not there for the Constitution. This is a different person, James Madison. I have a special fondness for James Madison, if only because he was 5'4" and only weighed 99 pounds. I mean, that's great. But James Madison is very much influenced also by the Enlightenment, and he has some strong ideas about how the government should be created. Now, there are a lot of people, a lot more people than the Declaration of Independence, that have their hand in this, but he is a leading figure. And if that shows up on the test, you might want to know the difference between those two, who helped write which one. And so he, heavily influenced by the Enlightenment, wants to have three separate branches of government. And people get confused about this, and this is certainly something you're going to learn about in more detail in government class. But we're going to talk about something called federalism, which is dividing up state, national, and local power, and then, of course, these three separate branches that have specific jobs. And the first branch, and I'm sure you've heard this before, is the legislative branch. And I highlighted here the L and the L. The legislative branch makes laws. Presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, often say, well, I will do this and I will do that. They can do a lot of things, and they can influence their Congress to make laws. Really, it's our Congress. But they can't make laws. They actually have no power to make law at all. So if the current president, the next president, or the president before wanted to, I don't know, change the speed limit, they can do things to encourage people to change the speed limit here, there, or wherever, but they can't actually do it themselves. It's not their job. They don't make the laws. What they do, your executive branch, enforces the law. They enforce the law. Technically speaking, the President of the United States could pull you over for speeding because a police officer is in the executive branch. The president is at the top of that branch. Now, there's a lot of symbolic jobs as well, but These are separate powers. They enforce the law. They do not make the law. And we're going to show you some examples of that in action. And then the third branch, and if I'm moving too fast, of course you have the great power you won't have when we're live, which is to pause me. But the judicial branch judges or interprets the laws. So I always give the example of speeding. Let's say I take one of you and you just get your license, you're at that age, and you decide just insanely to go 100 miles an hour down Hayes Avenue. When you get pulled over, and you're going to get pulled over. You're going to get pulled over by the executive branch. That's who's going to pull you over. That's the police officers are members of the executive branch. And you might say, but that's crazy. The speed limit should be 100. I'm a great driver and this is how fast it should be. When they get done laughing, they will remind you that they are not the people that make the laws. They simply enforce it. If you want to change the law, you'll have to go to the legislative branch. Those are the people who could say, oh, sure, the speed limit can be 100 on Hayes Avenue. Now, because you so egregiously broke the law, you're going to have to go to court. Now, I'll make myself the crazy driver. If I have to go to court for 100 miles an hour, it's not because I broke the speed limit. People get speeding tickets, they don't have to go to court unless they contest it. If I were going 42 on Hayes Avenue and I got a speeding ticket, I wouldn't have to go to court. I'd have to pay a fine. But if I'm going 100, now I probably have to go to court because I'm doing something reckless, or at least I'm accused of that. Who will judge or interpret the law to say, am I driving recklessly when the speed limit is 25 or 35, whatever it is, and I'm going 100? I think the judge is going to interpret that, but that's whose job that is. It's not, if I say, but that's crazy, the law should be 100. The judge will say the same thing the police officer says. It's not my job to make the law. Go talk to the legislative branch. Now, for a city speed limit, and this is a federalism thing, that would be your city commissioners. So I could go to a city commission meeting and say, I would love for the speed limit to be 100. And when they got done laughing, they probably wouldn't do that. Okay, so let me show you a picture and see if this makes more sense. So this is up to date with the exception of Ruth Bader Ginsburg here on the Supreme Court, which would be the judicial branch. She just passed away. So this seat is actually open and will be probably have a new judge fairly soon. But if we look at this is the government at the national level, okay? We have at the national level a chief executive, the President of the United States. So that's E for executive. At the national level, at the top level, you have the judicial branch. At the Supreme Court is the top level of the judicial branch. They interpret or judge the laws. And then Congress, here, this is a picture of the congressional building, they make the laws. No one person gets all of that power. Those laws are spread out. So, for example, the judicial branch can interpret a law, and it can even say a law is unconstitutional because as they interpret it, it doesn't match the Constitution. So we'll talk about a lot of court cases, like, for example, though, Brown versus Board. The Supreme Court interpreted that it wasn't in holding with the ideals of the United States to segregate schools. They judged or interpreted that, even though some southern states had laws that said that you could. They overruled that. They have checks and balances on each other. And we'll get to checks and balances. And you don't have to write this part down. I'm just trying to explain sort of the process. But this is at the national level, okay? This same system is replicated at the state level. So this is our state legislature. This is our Governor, Mike DeWine. He is the chief executive. In a way, it's very similar. He is sort of president of Ohio. Now, we call it governor, and that's fine, but it's a similar function. And at the state level, we have the state Supreme Court, and they judge or interpret the laws. And at the state level, we have the legislative branch. So the state house, the state legislature. Same process here. If you want to, let's go back up here. If we're talking about a national law, the drinking age in the United States is 21. That was written by our national legislature. Now, it's up to the president, and that goes all the way down the system to enforce it, and the judicial court to judge or interpret it. Now, that has nothing to do with the state level. They didn't come up with that law. But in Ohio, the state legislature did decide that 10th graders have to pass, you have to get 2 citizenship or 2 seals to graduate. And one of the, I think, easier ones to get is citizenship. So they decide what you have to do to graduate from school. Now, that wasn't decided by our national legislature. So if you move to a different state, and that happens fairly often, I'll have a student who moves and they're upset because they email me and they go, oh, I was all set to graduate. I was all on track. Now I have to pass this new set of tests. I'm sorry, that stinks. But every state gets to do their own thing. And so this whole little system is replicated at the local level. So there are certain laws that are just for the state of Ohio. And in the state, they make up rules, for example, like, oh, here's what you have to do to graduate. That system is replicated again at the local level. Whoops, didn't mean to almost draw a line through Mr. Whoopser. So at the local level, very similar. You have a mayor, or in your case, city manager. That's your chief executive. In a weird way, Mr. Whoopser is kind of like the president of Sandusky. He at least serves the function of chief executive. Now, I've got these flipped from the other ones. The Erie County Courthouse or the Sandusky Courthouse, that would be your judicial branch. They're going to judge or interpret the laws. And your legislative branch would be the city commissioners. So here we're talking about something at the local level. So the speed limit on Hayes would be decided by this panel of people. And it would be enforced by Mr. Whoopser. So in other words, he oversees the police officers. And he can even say, oh, hey, there's been a lot of people speeding on Hayes. Let's put some more officers down there. He has that authority. And then if I did that thing where I'm going 100 miles an hour, this is where I'm going to appear to judge or interpret whether or not I'm so dangerous, maybe I should lose my license. So to make this clear, you have to know, really to truly understand what's going on, each branch, but you have to know, well, what type of law is it? Is it a national law? Is it a state law? Or is it a local level law before you know what to complain about? I served as a local legislative branch member, a city council member. It's city commissioners here, but where I live in Norwalk, it's city council. And so I got to help make the laws for 6 years in the city of Norwalk. People would sometimes get confused and call me about things that we had nothing to do with. I had someone express great displeasure with me about the death penalty. Oh my goodness, let me make sure you understand. Your local legislators, your city councilmen, city commissioners have nothing to do with the death penalty. It doesn't matter what they think about it other than how they vote as regular citizens. There's no death penalty thing that's specific to Sandusky or Norwalk or whatever city. But ironically, when my oldest child was younger, Norwalk changed their curfew. And he was really upset about it. And he's like, man, I don't know what jerks changed the curfew and made it lower, but I'm mad at them. Well, ironically, it was me, and he should have known that because I served on the local legislative branch. So if you are upset about a city law, like curfew, you'd call one of these 7 people. You really wouldn't call Mr. Whoopser. He might share your views with these guys, but he doesn't set the curfew for Sandusky. He just enforces it. And if you're caught breaking curfew, you're going to be judged or interpreted by how much you went over. So, for example, if you got caught for curfew and you're 1 minute over curfew, they might judge or interpret that it's not really worth it. They might say, sorry, you're in trouble. Now, if you are upset about curfew in Sandusky and you go to the state legislature, they're going to say, you don't understand government. You're going to the wrong place. Or if you go to the national legislature and say, this is unfair. I don't like our curfew. It has nothing to do with it. You have the national level for the United States, big laws, the things that you think of as, the big picture stuff. Drinking age is 21, don't murder people, all of these other basic things. And then at the state level, it's more state specific. What do you have to do to get your license? It's a little different in each state. What do you have to do when you get your license plates? In some states, like Ohio, license plates are, $50. In Connecticut, where my son was for a while, I think a license was almost a plate was almost $1,000 because they do their taxes differently and different ones are lower, but the tax on having a license plate is huge. So we just kept the car in my name and let him have an Ohio license plate. I mean, that's a big difference, but that's an example of different states having different rules. And then at the local level, this is specific to your town. So if you're talking about the speed limit on Hayes, that's going to be done by this local level. If you're talking about the speed limit on a State Route 113, that's done by the state level. If you're talking about the speed limit on I-75, an interstate that goes through all of these different states and it's run by the national government, that's the national level. And all of these show these things called checks and balances. On every version of the test, I ask for at least one. And so these are just examples of how one branch of government can make it so that another branch isn't too powerful. And I think the easiest one to remember is the veto. You know, the President of the United States can veto a law passed by the legislative branch. And that's sometimes how laws are killed. Now, if enough people in the legislative branch, 2/3, don't like that, they can override the veto. That's actually even more uncommon because it's hard to get 2/3 of Congress to agree on anything. The judicial branch can declare a law unconstitutional. These are all examples of checks or balances of power on each branch. We're not one of those countries like North Korea where one person gets to do all of this, where they can just decide what the laws are and just dictate everything. That's not how we're set up. We're set up to have we were afraid of kings, and that's why this federal system with 3 branches of government exists. Okay, let's bounce back to your notes. I know I rambled on a little long there, but I think some of you may not know that, and I want to make sure you do know that. So they had checks and balances on each other, and we talked about the veto. So compromises were reached. Now these notes are going to be in blue because you don't have to write them down, but other than the 3 branches, there were a lot of things they argued about. I mean, a lot of things. And one of the biggest ones was, how would we do the counting for the legislative branch? Would it be like the Articles of Confederation where big states and little states all just had the equal number of votes? Or would it be totally based on population, which made small states upset? They felt like they would be ignored. Well, they had this great compromise. And again, it's in blue, so you don't have to know the name of this. But it is just a good thing to know as you go into government class. It's why we split it. We compromised by saying, okay, in the Senate, it's going to be the same. No matter what size state you are, in the Senate, you get 2 senators. So any state you can name. California, millions and millions more people than South Dakota. They get 2 senators. South Dakota also gets 2 senators. Ohio gets 2 senators. I mean, you can impress your parents right now. Turn around and tell them, I memorized the number of senators from every state. Because the answer is 2. It doesn't matter what state I name, the answer is 2. That's why the Senate has, wait for it, 100 members. 2 senators from every state, 50 states. But in the House of Representatives, it's based on population. So a state like Texas, a state like California, a state like New York, they have more representatives than a small state like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, something like that. Ohio's kind of in the middle. The 3/5 compromise, also not on the test, but it showed that slavery was already a very divisive issue, and this was how they were going to count people towards the membership in the House, because they had to do a head count to see, well, how many representatives will each state get? And this was the gross compromise they came up with in regards to counting slaves towards that population. Because some people said, oh, you want to count slaves? Great. It must mean you're going to treat them as citizens and slavery's over. Good. And the South was like, no, no, no. We only want to count them to help us get more members of the House. We're not going to treat them as equals. Well, that's awful. So they came up with this really gross 3/5 compromise. Last notes for today. So right away, after this plan that eventually we think of as the Constitution is unveiled, there were people for and against this Constitution. The people who were for it are called the Federalists. The people who are against it, and it's always going to be a big hint when you see anti, they're against something. They're the Anti-Federalists. And that's what we're going to focus on tomorrow, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Okay? So those are all your notes for today. Those notes are easy to use on your test coming up in a couple weeks. But if you don't bother to take these notes, it'll work out for you if you happen to know all of this already. But if you don't, you might want to make sure you have that written down so it's easily accessible, because that's, again, why we also time those tests. So tomorrow you're going to have a graded review guide, and just like everything else in here, when I have an assignment posted for that day, in the documents of the week, I actually give you 5 days, but worksheets and things like that, forms, it's going to be due by midnight of the day I assign it. So tomorrow morning, and you don't have to get up for this, but at 7 a.m., you're going to have your lecture release for tomorrow and your assignment release for that day, and the assignment will be due at midnight or 11:59 on Friday, the same day we assign it. So the lecture will be a little less so that you can get that done, and it's for a grade, so I hope you do well on it. All right, thanks everybody, and make sure you get your document of the week done. Have a good day.